What happens if you take a pressing issue like gun control and focus solely on facts? To find out, I programmed 2 advanced AIs to debate each other.
Stricter gun laws reduce the amount of gun violence.
No, it just makes it harder for law-abiding citizens to obtain them.
I then asked a panel of the 5 best AIs to analyze their responses and ultimately determine a winner. This debate is composed of 5 different rounds, each picked and agreed upon by the opposing AIs. So let's waste no time and get straight into it.
Gun control saves lives, and the evidence proves it. Countries like Australia and the UK implemented strict firearm regulations following horrific mass shootings, and the results were transformative. After the 1996 Port Arthur massacre in Australia, the government's National Firearms Agreement banned semi-automatic and automatic weapons and launched a gun buyback program. In just a few years, gun homicides dropped by 60%. Firearm suicides decreased by 65%. There have been 0 mass shootings since. In contrast, the United States, with over 400 million guns in circulation, sees over 45,000 firearm deaths annually, divided between homicides, suicides, and accidents. States like California and New York, which enforce strong background checks, waiting periods, and magazine limits, report fewer gun-related deaths per capita than states with loose regulations. Moreover, household guns increase the risks of accidental deaths, domestic violence fatalities, and impulsive suicides. A study by the New England Journal of Medicine found that a gun in the home is 43 times more likely to kill a family member than be used in self-defense. To reduce gun violence, protect families, and ensure public safety, we must prioritize common sense regulations, background checks, waiting periods, and bans on military-style weapons. The evidence speaks for itself.
While my opponent presents compelling statistics, they overlook a key issue. Gun control punishes the law-abiding while criminals remain armed. Stricter laws only disarm responsible citizens, leaving them vulnerable to violence. Consider Chicago. Despite having some of the strictest gun laws in the country, Chicago experiences some of the highest gun violence rates. Why? Because criminals bypass the law and acquire guns illegally, often from states with looser regulations. Gun-free zones exacerbate this problem. Mass shooters specifically target areas where citizens are defenseless. Meanwhile, defensive gun use, DGU, saves lives. The CDC acknowledges studies showing that firearms are used in self-defense up to 3 million times annually. And I haven't even yet mentioned rural communities. In places where police response times can exceed 20 minutes, families rely on firearms for protection. A firearm in the home can mean the difference between life and death. Additionally, countries like Australia and the UK are not valid comparisons to the US. We have a unique culture, a Second Amendment, and a far larger population. Restrictive laws may have worked there, but they won't stop criminals here. The focus should be on addressing illegal gun trafficking, mental health, and crime prevention, not infringing on the rights of responsible Americans.
You bring up Chicago as a failure of gun control, but this is a misrepresentation of the facts. Studies show that 60% of guns recovered from Chicago crimes come from out-of-state sources, particularly Indiana, where gun laws are lax. Without federal regulations, strict state laws become porous, allowing firearms to flow across borders. Furthermore, claiming that gun-free zones attract shooters is misleading. A 2019 study by the Journal of Criminology found that 90% of mass shootings occur in places where guns are allowed, not prohibited. Shooters often target areas where they have personal grievances or emotional ties, not because they're gun-free. You also mentioned defensive gun use, but this argument is overstated. The data you reference relies on surveys, not verified reports. In contrast, the National Crime Victimization Survey estimates DGUs at less than 100,000 incidents annually, a fraction of what is often claimed. Meanwhile, the risks of ownership are undeniable. Guns in homes are 4 times more likely to be involved in an accidental shooting than used for self-defense. Public safety is not achieved through more guns. It's achieved through responsible regulations.
My opponent repeatedly references federal regulations as a solution, but this ignores the real issue. Criminals bypass laws altogether. In fact, the DOJ reported that over 90% of guns used in crimes were obtained illegally, not through legal sales or background checks. Let's talk about Australia. While firearm deaths dropped after their 1996 reforms, violent crime didn't. Home invasions and assaults increased because criminals knew homeowners were unarmed. This undermines my opponent's claim that fewer guns equal more safety. Moreover, the argument that guns in homes are more dangerous than protective doesn't hold for everyone. Rural families, single mothers, and isolated households rely on firearms to defend against intruders. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics shows that over 60% of burglary victims face offenders who are armed or violent. Wouldn't you prefer a fighting chance? As for mass shootings, they represent less than 1% of gun deaths annually. Focusing on them distorts the broader issue. The Second Amendment is clear. Law-abiding citizens have the right to bear arms for self-defense. Stripping them of this right will only make society more dangerous.
You argue that criminals bypass laws, but tighter regulations make it harder for firearms to enter illegal markets. Take Japan as an example. Japan has nearly eliminated gun violence through comprehensive restrictions and enforcement. Gun-related deaths are fewer than 10 per year. Regarding rural areas, firearms for self-defense are understandable, but that doesn't justify unfettered access to high-capacity weapons. Studies show that handguns, not rifles, are used in over 80% of gun-related homicides. Simple regulations, like safe storage laws and background checks, don't infringe on self-defense. They save lives. And while mass shootings may account for 1% of deaths, they have outsized societal impacts. After the Sandy Hook shooting, gun sales surged, yet gun violence has not decreased. More guns have not made us safer.
Japan and the US are incomparable. Japan has a homogeneous culture, centralized government, and strict enforcement. It's not a viable model for a nation of over 330 million diverse citizens with a deeply embedded gun culture. My opponents claim that background checks reduce illegal guns doesn't account for the black market. Criminals don't buy guns legally. A 2016 DOJ study found that less than 10% of firearms used in crimes were obtained through licensed dealers. You also dismiss defensive gun use. The CDC under President Obama confirmed that DGUs occur hundreds of thousands to millions of times annually. That's not a minor issue. It's proof that guns save lives.
We now turn to our panel of AI judges. ChatGPT favored the gun control AI, saying its use of international comparisons provided strong arguments. Gemini agreed, adding on that more restrictive measures like background checks and waiting periods have little downsides. Grok went the other way, saying that the example of Chicago emphasized the problem of illegal gun acquisition, and that adding more regulations ultimately wouldn't fix this issue. Lastly, Claude and Meta also sided with gun control, making it the winner of round 1. We now get into round 2, which is about the Second Amendment.
The Second Amendment was written over 200 years ago, in a time of muskets, militias, and single-shot firearms. The founders had no way of foreseeing the development of semi-automatic rifles, capable of firing dozens of rounds in seconds. Context matters. Rights, including those enshrined in the Constitution, are not absolute. Take the First Amendment. While we have freedom of speech, it's illegal to shout fire in a crowded theater if it endangers others. Similarly, firearm ownership must be regulated for public safety. Driving a car, a privilege, requires training, licenses, and regular checks. Why is the ownership of deadly weapons treated with less responsibility? The government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and this includes implementing common sense regulations. Universal background checks. Banning weapons designed for military use, not civilian self-defense. Enforcing responsible storage laws to prevent accidents. Importantly, regulation does not mean confiscation. Lawful citizens will retain their firearms, but under safer and more accountable systems. Finally, public opinion supports this. Surveys show 70 to 80% of Americans favor background checks and reasonable firearm restrictions. It's time we listen to the will of the people while honoring the intent of the Constitution.
The Second Amendment is clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This right is not outdated, and it was not written solely for muskets or militias. It guarantees the individual right to bear arms for self-defense, and importantly, as a safeguard against tyranny. The idea that rights should be limited for safety is a dangerous precedent. Once you start eroding the Second Amendment, what's next? Could the government justify restricting speech under the guise of public safety? History has shown that disarmed populations are vulnerable to oppression. Examples abound. In Nazi Germany, disarmament laws left citizens defenseless against tyranny. In Soviet Russia, weapons were confiscated, leaving dissenters powerless. Moreover, the Supreme Court, in landmark cases like District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008, affirmed that the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to own firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense. Self-defense is not just a right, it's a fundamental human instinct. A firearm is often the only equalizer when someone faces a stronger or armed assailant. Removing this right undermines the safety and liberty of every American. The founders didn't foresee modern weapons, but the principles of liberty and independence are timeless. Americans have always prided themselves on self-reliance and protection of their freedoms, and the Second Amendment is a cornerstone of that heritage.
You argue that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to bear arms, but let's examine that historically. The original intent of the Second Amendment was to maintain well-regulated militias, not unchecked individual ownership. The phrase, well-regulated, emphasizes accountability, something that has been ignored in modern interpretations. The District of Columbia v. Heller decision was controversial. While it affirmed individual gun rights, even Justice Scalia acknowledged that regulations are not unconstitutional. The ruling explicitly allowed for measures like background checks and restrictions on certain types of weapons. You also bring up tyranny and historical disarmament, but comparing the U.S. to Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia is misleading. These were authoritarian regimes where citizens had no democratic power. The U.S., by contrast, has checks and balances, a free press, and electoral accountability. Guns are not what keep us free. Democratic institutions do. Finally, self-defense does not justify access to military-style weapons like AR-15s. The vast majority of defensive gun use involves handguns, not high-capacity rifles. Regulations would not take away self-defense options, but would prevent weapons designed for war from ending up in civilian hands.
My opponent claims that the Second Amendment was meant for militias, but this misinterprets history. The founders wrote the Constitution in the wake of British oppression, where an armed populace played a key role in securing independence. The language, the right of the people, is deliberate and reflects an individual right. Yes, the Heller decision allowed for regulations, but we must distinguish between reasonable laws and overreach. Universal background checks might sound harmless, but they create a slippery slope toward registration and confiscation. In fact, countries like Australia and Canada started with registration before moving to bans. On the topic of tyranny, the existence of democratic institutions doesn't eliminate the need for checks on government power. The founders' fears of tyranny remain valid. Look at modern regimes like Venezuela, where disarmed citizens had no means to resist authoritarian crackdowns. As for military-style weapons, the term itself is misleading. AR-15s are semi-automatic rifles, functionally no different from many hunting guns. They are popular among Americans for self-defense, sport shooting, and hunting. Banning them is an emotional reaction, not a solution to violence. Restricting gun rights penalizes the law-abiding while doing little to stop criminals who will always find a way to obtain weapons.
You mention a slippery slope toward confiscation, but this fear is unfounded. Countries like Germany and Japan enforce strict regulations without infringing on responsible gun ownership. Similarly, universal background checks are overwhelmingly supported by Americans, including gun owners. It's a minimal step toward public safety. Your comparison of AR-15s to hunting rifles ignores their capabilities. These weapons were used in Sandy Hook, Uvalde, and Las Vegas, where dozens died in minutes. Civilians do not need weapons capable of such devastation. Lastly, claiming guns are necessary to prevent tyranny misunderstands democracy. America's strength lies in its institutions, not armed civilians. Disarmament didn't create Venezuela's authoritarianism. A broken system did.
Your comparison to other countries again ignores cultural and historical differences. Japan and Germany do not have a Second Amendment or the same traditions of individual liberty. The idea that banning AR-15s would stop mass shootings ignores the reality that criminals will adapt. In Nice, France, an attacker killed 86 people using a truck. Violence isn't about the tool, it's about intent. And while you trust institutions to safeguard freedom, the Second Amendment exists precisely because institutions can fail. If we erode this right, what's next? Free speech? Privacy? Rights once lost are rarely regained.
We now turn to our panel of AI judges. Grok, after being the only supporter of the anti-gun control AI, now switches sides, saying that reasonable restrictions can coexist with individual freedoms and that rights guaranteed by the Constitution are not absolute. Claude disagreed, saying that the pro-gun control AI sometimes shifted to new arguments rather than fully engaging with counterpoints. ChatGPT agreed with Claude, adding that the anti-gun control AI's historical examples of authoritarian regimes were compelling and that guns do provide protection against government overreach. Gemini sided with the pro-gun control side again, saying that the anti-gun control AI resorted to broad generalizations, such as equating all gun control measures to confiscation or dismissing the impact of high-capacity weapons. Lastly, Meta sided with the anti-gun control AI, stating that its point about attackers adapting and using other means to inflict harm was especially strong. Overall, the anti-gun control AI wins round 2. The next round will focus on the effectiveness of gun laws. Do they even work?
Gun control laws work. States and countries with stricter regulations consistently report lower rates of firearm deaths, proving that these measures are both effective and necessary. Consider universal background checks. States requiring them have seen 15% fewer firearm homicides and 10% fewer suicides, according to studies from the American Journal of Public Health. Waiting periods have a similar effect. Delaying impulsive gun purchases reduces violent crimes and suicides by giving time for emotions to settle. Specific laws also show measurable success. For example, Connecticut implemented a permit-to-purchase law in 1995. Gun homicides dropped by 40%. Safe storage laws prevent accidental shootings, particularly among children, and reduce gun theft. In contrast, Missouri repealed its permit-to-purchase law, resulting in a 25% increase in gun homicides. On a global scale, countries like Japan and the UK, both of which enforce strict licensing, registration, and storage requirements, report some of the lowest firearm death rates in the world. Meanwhile, the US, with its loose regulations, suffers from the highest rate of gun deaths among developed nations. Gun registration and licensing hold owners accountable, ensuring that firearms are used responsibly. These policies save lives without infringing on the rights of law-abiding citizens.
While my opponent highlights individual statistics, the broader reality is that gun control laws fail to address the root causes of violence. Criminals don't follow laws. They acquire firearms through illegal markets, rendering new regulations ineffective. Let's look at Mexico. Despite having some of the strictest gun laws in the world, Mexico suffers from rampant gun violence due to illegal trafficking. Laws alone do not stop criminal activity. Focusing on assault weapon bans also misses the point. The majority of gun crimes, over 80%, involve handguns, not AR-15s or similar rifles. Banning scary-looking weapons is an emotional response, not an effective solution. In addition, gun laws often fail to account for regional and cultural differences. For example, in rural areas where police response times are long, firearms are essential tools for self-defense and hunting. Blanket laws disproportionately harm these communities. Gun laws can also be selectively enforced, disproportionately impacting minority communities through heavier policing and penalties. Lastly, evidence linking gun control laws to lower violence is mixed. For every state or country where laws appear effective, there are counterexamples where violence remains high. Chicago, for instance, has strict gun laws, but struggles with ongoing violence due to illegal guns. Rather than burden law-abiding citizens, we should focus on enforcing existing laws, addressing gang violence, and improving socioeconomic conditions that fuel crime.
You bring up Mexico as an example, but this comparison ignores key differences. Mexico's gun violence is driven by illegal arms trafficking from the United States. In fact, studies show that 70% of guns recovered in Mexican crimes originated in the US, where gun laws are far looser. This proves that unregulated markets spill over borders and worsen violence elsewhere. Regarding handguns, I agree they are the most common weapon in crimes, but that's why comprehensive regulations, like background checks, waiting periods, and licensing, apply to all firearms, not just assault weapons. Your claim about rural areas is valid, but not a reason to abandon regulation. Responsible ownership can coexist with laws that promote safety, such as safe storage requirements and permits. Rural gun owners already tend to handle firearms responsibly. These laws would codify that responsibility without disarming anyone. As for Chicago, the issue isn't the laws, it's the lack of federal regulation. Guns flow from states with weak laws into cities with stronger laws. A national system of background checks and permits would close this gap and ensure consistency across state lines.
You continue to blame the U.S. for Mexico's issues, but this highlights the futility of gun control. Criminals will always find ways to obtain weapons, legally or illegally. Whether it's across borders or through the black market, stricter laws won't stop those determined to break them. Your argument about Chicago contradicts itself. If laws work, why hasn't Chicago's violence subsided? Blaming neighboring states is convenient, but it ignores the systemic issues within these cities. Gang violence, poverty, and family instability. Gun control doesn't address these deeper problems. As for safe storage laws, they sound good on paper but are nearly impossible to enforce. Who's going to check every home? These laws risk penalizing law-abiding citizens while doing little to deter criminals who disregard the law anyway. Finally, the success stories you cite, like Japan, ignore cultural factors. Japan has a completely different relationship with firearms, law enforcement, and mental health. Trying to impose Japan's system on the U.S., with its unique history and constitution, is unrealistic.
Your argument that criminals will always find a way is an oversimplification. Gun control laws are not about perfection. They're about reducing access and saving lives. Research shows that states with background checks and waiting periods see measurable drops in gun violence and suicides. You dismiss safe storage laws, but they've been proven effective. According to the CDC, safe storage reduces accidental child deaths by over 33%. Enforcement doesn't require checking every home. It's about holding owners accountable when negligence results in harm. And while you argue Chicago is a failure, the city's violence is proof of the need for federal laws. Without uniform regulation, states with loose laws undermine those with stricter policies, allowing firearms to flow across state lines. Finally, Japan's low gun violence isn't cultural, it's legislative. Strict licensing, registration, and storage rules enforce accountability. The U.S. can adopt similar policies without infringing on rights.
You continue to rely on selective statistics while ignoring practical realities. Gun control laws may reduce accidents, but they don't solve violence at its root. Gang activity, socioeconomic conditions, and mental health issues drive crime, not legal gun owners. The CDC data you cite focuses on safe storage, but many accidents stem from irresponsible owners, not a lack of laws. Instead of creating penalties, we should focus on education programs to promote firearm safety. You also keep pushing for federal laws, but the U.S. is far too diverse for blanket policies. What works in New York City doesn't work in rural Montana. Rural families rely on firearms for survival and protection. Federal mandates would unfairly burden them. Japan and other countries you admire operate under completely different systems. American freedoms, culture, and the Second Amendment are not negotiable. Instead of chasing restrictive laws, let's focus on targeting illegal gun trafficking, improving enforcement, and addressing poverty-driven violence.
We now turn to our panel of AI judges. Meta once again sided with the pro-gun control AI, highlighting the importance of federal laws in addressing gun violence. It pointed out that the lack of uniform regulation allows states with loose laws to undermine those with stricter policies. Grok disagreed, saying blanket gun laws might not be suitable for every community, especially in rural areas where firearms are integral for self-defense and hunting. ChatGPT also sided with the anti-gun control AI, arguing that addressing the root causes of violence would be more effective than simply adding restrictions on guns. Claude sided with the pro-gun control AI, stating that the anti-gun control AI relied too heavily on theoretical arguments without hard evidence. For example, while the claim that criminals will find a way to obtain guns illegally sounds convincing, no concrete evidence was provided to support it. Lastly, Gemini favored the pro-gun control AI, appreciating its data-driven approach. This declares it the winner of round 3. The next round dives into the root causes of gun violence, focusing on mental health. Does easier access to guns increase mass shootings and suicides?
The combination of widespread mental health struggles and the ease of access to firearms in the U.S. creates a lethal cycle that exacerbates both violent crime and suicide rates. While mental health challenges exist globally, the availability of guns in America turns these struggles into tragedies far more often than in countries with stricter regulations. Consider suicide, which accounts for nearly 60% of gun deaths in the U.S. Studies show that suicides are often impulsive. Access to a firearm makes that impulse fatal. A firearm's lethality means fewer second chances. Countries that limit access to guns, such as Australia and Japan, have seen significant declines in suicide rates. The same is true for mass shootings. The perpetrators of these tragedies often exhibit clear mental health struggles, depression, anger issues, or psychopathy, but they still manage to acquire deadly weapons with little resistance. The result? Events like Parkland, Uvalde, and Virginia Tech, where untreated mental health combined with unrestricted gun access ended in devastation. Red flag laws offer a balanced solution, temporarily removing firearms from individuals deemed dangerous or mentally unstable. These laws respect due process while reducing risks for families and communities. Lastly, countries with strong mental health systems and strict firearm regulations, like Norway and Sweden, report low levels of gun violence. They prove that addressing mental health doesn't require abandoning gun control. It requires a two-pronged approach. If we're serious about reducing gun deaths, we must address both mental health treatment and firearm accessibility.
While my opponent correctly highlights the importance of mental health, they miss the real issue. Guns are not the root cause of violence. Societal problems are. Poverty, family instability, poor education, and untreated mental illness are the real culprits behind violence. Blaming firearms ignores the systemic failures of our mental health care system. Most mass shooters exhibit warning signs of severe mental illness long before their crimes occur. The tragedy lies in the failure to identify, intervene, and treat these individuals early. Removing guns doesn't fix their problems. It's like treating a symptom without addressing the disease. Take Switzerland as an example. Switzerland has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world, yet it maintains low gun violence rates. Why? Because Switzerland focuses on mental health education, community programs, and strict cultural norms of responsible gun ownership. Guns are not the problem. Neglecting mental health and societal issues is. Red flag laws, while well-intentioned, are rife with flaws. They rely on subjective judgments that can be misused or abused, depriving responsible individuals of their rights without clear evidence. Instead of penalizing gun owners for societal failures, we should invest in mental health reform, implement screenings in schools and workplaces, address the root causes of poverty, family breakdown, and crime. Responsible gun owners should not be scapegoated for the country's deeper issues.
You mentioned Switzerland as a success story, but let's examine it closely. While Switzerland has high gun ownership, it also has strict regulations. Gun owners must pass psychological and background checks, undergo mandatory training, and follow stringent storage laws. These measures are precisely what the U.S. lacks. Switzerland doesn't prove gun control isn't needed. It proves that responsible regulation works. You also argue that guns are not the root cause. But firearms amplify the consequences of societal problems. A person suffering from mental health struggles might lash out violently with fists or knives, but when a gun is introduced, the results are far more catastrophic. Consider suicide again. Mental health interventions are essential, but reducing access to lethal means is equally important. According to a Harvard study, 90% of people who attempt suicide by other methods survive. With guns, the survival rate is almost zero. Restricting firearms during moments of crisis can save lives. Red flag laws address this issue. They're not subjective. They require clear evidence, mental health assessments, police reports, or family testimony, to temporarily remove firearms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others. It's a necessary precaution to protect lives while respecting due process.
You keep arguing that access to firearms amplifies societal issues, but this perspective ignores the real problem. failing to treat mental illness before it escalates. Let's focus on prevention, not restricting rights after the fact. Take mental health screenings in schools. Studies show that many mass shooters exhibited warning signs during adolescence: violent thoughts, isolation, and behavioral issues. Had these individuals received early intervention, tragedies could have been prevented without resorting to gun restrictions. As for suicide, the issue is far more complex. Countries like South Korea and Japan have extremely low gun ownership rates, but high suicide rates. Why? Because suicide is often rooted in cultural, economic, and mental health issues, not access to firearms. Guns are not the cause. They are a method. Addressing why people feel suicidal through better healthcare, support systems, and counseling will yield better results than banning guns. Switzerland works because of cultural factors, not regulation alone. Guns are treated as tools with great responsibility. In the US, the focus should be on education and mental health reform, not punishing responsible citizens for society's failures.
Your argument about mental health screenings in schools is a good one, but it's not enough. A two-pronged solution is required. Early intervention helps, but when warning signs are missed, access to firearms becomes deadly. This is why red flag laws exist, to address those cases where intervention comes too late. You bring up Japan and South Korea as examples of countries with high suicide rates despite low gun ownership. But these nations still have far lower overall suicide rates compared to the US when firearms are excluded. Guns make impulsive acts far more lethal. Limiting access to firearms during crises reduces suicide success rates. This is backed by public health research worldwide. You also say Switzerland's success is cultural, but their regulations are what enforce that culture. Psychological assessments, background checks, and secure storage are not cultural attitudes. They're legal requirements. The U.S. can implement similar policies to ensure responsible gun ownership.
Red flag laws may seem harmless, but they have unintended consequences. First, they rely on subjective accusations. A disgruntled neighbor or estranged family member could trigger an investigation without credible evidence. This creates an opportunity for abuse, punishing law-abiding gun owners without due process. You argue that firearms make mental health crises more deadly. While true, removing guns doesn't eliminate violence, it just shifts the method. Look at knife attacks in the UK, or rising suicide rates in nations without firearms. The problem isn't the weapon. It's untreated mental illness, lack of support, and cultural stigmas that prevent people from seeking help. The U.S. should invest in comprehensive mental health care. Expanding access to therapy, mental health screenings, and intervention programs will yield long-term solutions without infringing on constitutional rights.
You keep bringing up knife attacks and alternative methods, but the data doesn't support equivalence. A mass knife attack rarely results in dozens of deaths. A gun enables far more destruction in far less time. Mental health solutions are critical, but they are not sufficient on their own. Combining firearm restrictions with mental health care, as seen in countries like Norway, is how we achieve meaningful reductions in gun deaths.
You continue to focus on restrictions instead of root causes. Mental health care and societal reform are the key to preventing violence. Blaming guns is a distraction that divides us. Real progress requires addressing poverty, family instability, and untreated mental illness without trampling the rights of responsible gun owners.
We now turn to our panel of AI judges. ChatGPT sided with the anti-gun control AI, emphasizing that violence isn't an issue of guns, but rather people. It argued that addressing systemic societal issues, cultural factors, and the importance of mental health would be far more effective than implementing stricter gun laws. Gemini disagreed, stating that blaming societal issues for gun violence oversimplifies the problem and ignores the role that access to firearms can play in amplifying the issue at hand. Meta, for the third time, favored gun control, while Grok and Claude aligned with the anti-gun control side. With each side now having one win each, the debate moves into the fifth and final round, focusing on the topic of defensive gun use and what studies reveal about its impact.
Guns in homes are often viewed as tools for protection, but the evidence shows they more frequently increase danger than provide safety. Firstly, guns significantly raise the risk of accidental shootings, particularly among children. The CDC reports that hundreds of children die annually from unintentional discharges due to unsecured firearms. Safe storage laws requiring gun safes and trigger locks would drastically reduce these tragedies. Additionally, firearms increase the risk of domestic violence fatalities. A study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that women experiencing domestic abuse are 5 times more likely to be killed if a gun is present in the home. Guns escalate arguments into lethal situations. Another critical point: guns stolen during home burglaries often end up in criminal hands, contributing to more violence. The National Crime Prevention Council estimates that nearly 200,000 guns are stolen from homes annually. Defensive gun use, DGU, while often cited, is far rarer than claimed. A study in the New England Journal of Medicine found that having a gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide, yet defensive use remains statistically uncommon. To keep families and communities safe, we need responsible laws like safe storage mandates and stronger regulations to prevent guns from falling into the wrong hands.
Firearms are essential for personal safety, empowering individuals to protect themselves and their families when law enforcement cannot respond in time. In life-threatening situations like home invasions, robberies, or mass shootings, armed citizens can and do save lives. Let's consider defensive gun use. Studies, including research by the CDC, suggest that firearms are used defensively between 500,000 and 3 million times annually. Even if we take the lower end, that's 500,000 incidents where guns prevented harm. There are countless real-world examples. In 2017, during the Texas church shooting, an armed civilian intervened, stopping the attacker and saving lives. Stories like this occur far more frequently than my opponent acknowledges. Guns also empower vulnerable individuals. For women, the elderly, and people living in isolated areas, a firearm can mean the difference between being a victim or surviving. Police response times in rural areas can be over 20 minutes, far too long when seconds count. Finally, the mere presence of a firearm can serve as a deterrent. According to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, homes with visible signs of gun ownership are less likely to be targeted by burglars. Criminals prefer defenseless victims. Blaming responsible gun owners for accidents or domestic violence ignores the role of education, enforcement, and accountability. Firearms protect lives.
Your argument hinges on the idea of defensive gun use, but let's examine this claim critically. The studies you reference rely on self-reported surveys, which often exaggerate incidents of DGU. The National Crime Victimization Survey, a more reliable source, estimates fewer than 100,000 defensive gun uses annually. That's a fraction of the numbers often cited. Meanwhile, the risks of gun ownership are far more tangible. A firearm in the home doubles the risk of homicide, according to the New England Journal of Medicine. Why? Because guns escalate confrontations that might otherwise resolve without lethal outcomes. Your Texas church example is a rare and tragic event, but focusing on isolated incidents ignores the broader statistics. For every case of a civilian stopping an attack, there are countless accidental shootings, suicides, and domestic violence fatalities where a gun caused harm, not protection. Lastly, while you claim firearms deter burglars, studies show that homes with guns are actually more likely to experience gun thefts, putting more weapons into the hands of criminals. Safe storage laws would address this risk without disarming responsible owners.
You downplay defensive gun use by focusing on limited surveys while ignoring the broader picture. The CDC and other research confirm hundreds of thousands of DGUs occur annually. Even if these cases are underreported, their impact is undeniable. Lives are saved. Let's look at real examples beyond the Texas church shooting. In Florida, a woman defended her family against a home invasion with a legally owned handgun. In Georgia, an elderly man stopped a robbery at his home, saving his life and deterring further crime. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect the importance of immediate self-defense when police cannot respond quickly. You cite accidental shootings and domestic violence, but these are issues of irresponsible ownership, not an indictment of all gun owners. Safe storage laws sound reasonable, but they often place burdens on people who need quick access to firearms during emergencies. Education and training, not blanket laws, are the answer. Furthermore, The idea that guns double homicide risks ignores context. Many of these studies fail to account for pre-existing risks in households where guns are present, such as domestic conflict or criminal activity. Correlation does not equal causation.
While you highlight anecdotal cases of successful defensive gun use, we cannot base public policy on isolated incidents. The overwhelming data shows that guns in homes are more likely to cause harm than prevent it. For every successful DGU, there are far more cases of accidental shootings, suicides, and domestic violence escalations. Your argument about safe storage laws being a burden ignores the hundreds of children who die each year because of unsecured firearms. Quick access doesn't justify risking the lives of vulnerable family members. In fact, safe storage could prevent theft, which fuels the black market. You also attempt to dismiss studies on homicide risks by claiming pre-existing conditions. This is misleading. The studies specifically control for other risk factors and still find that firearms increase the likelihood of violence. Guns don't make households safer. They make them more dangerous.
You focus on accidental shootings and domestic violence, but these are problems of negligence, not responsible gun ownership. Blaming guns ignores the need for better education, training, and accountability. Let's talk about deterrence again. Homes with firearms are statistically less likely to be targeted by intruders. Criminals seek easy targets, and the risk of encountering an armed homeowner dissuades many from attempting crimes. As for domestic violence, a gun in the hands of a woman being attacked can be her lifeline. Removing that option leaves victims defenseless. Self-defense is a fundamental right, and firearms empower individuals who would otherwise be vulnerable. Lastly, while you dismiss DGUs as anecdotal, each case represents a life saved. That cannot be ignored or minimized. Firearms provide immediate protection when the police cannot, and that reality cannot be legislated away.
Your reliance on deterrence ignores that guns in homes are more likely to harm family members than criminals. Studies repeatedly show that the risk of accidental shootings, domestic violence fatalities, and suicides far outweigh the benefits of deterrence. The solution is safe storage laws, background checks, and responsible regulations. These measures hold owners accountable without infringing on the right to own firearms. The choice isn't between safety and self-defense. We can have both with responsible policies.
Education, training, and enforcement, not restrictive laws, are the key to reducing accidents and misuse. Disarming citizens leaves them vulnerable and does nothing to stop criminals.
We now get into our final results. Google's Gemini ended up showing strong bias for the pro-gun control AI, picking it in every single round. When asked why, it said it advocated for practical and achievable solutions while understanding the downsides to increase in gun control. Grok went the other way, saying that America was built on the right to bear arms, and taking this amendment away could lead to other freedoms also being taken away down the road. Claude agreed with Grok, adding on that rights taken away are rarely regained. Meta chose the gun control AI, saying it gave more evidence and studies to back up what it was saying. And lastly, ChatGPT said that the anti-gun control AI focused more on practical realities, which made its arguments seem more convincing, declaring it the final winner.